I don't think it's fair to compare these two games, because Hellblade 1 and 2 have more differences between them than any direct sequel I've seen that didn't advertise itself as a reinvention of its franchise. Whereas Sacrifice was a folk horror introspective puzzle game, Saga is an action-adventure relationship-focused game. Both games have strengths that help separate them from each other, and I reject the notion that Hellblade 2 is just more of the same, when in fact, I think it's superior. Firstly, while Hellblade 2 focuses less on puzzle solving, its new puzzle type is far more enjoyable and less pervasive than the environmental rune matching puzzle of Sacrifice. The hidden folk puzzles are nowhere near as tricky as the rune puzzles, but they feel like a proper use of the AAA budget for puzzle solving. There haven't been any significant AAA puzzle games since Portal, because developers can't figure out a puzzle type that would take advantage of hardware like the Portal gun did. While instant terrain swapping is nowhere near as revolutionary, it's something that an indie game would struggle to do without an arcade aesthetic. A big piece of praise I have for Hellblade 2 is how cinematic the game can be. It never feels like you're playing a video game, and it's prudent to never take you out of the experience, whereas in Hellblade 1, I'd have to wander around the environment looking for the glowing runes. Hellblade 2 has a more straightforward, but more smooth puzzles that don't break the pacing of the game when you get turned around. Next, Senua's story is expanded by having her interact with other fleshed-out characters. In Sacrifice, Senua's story is about her fragile state of mind, and her condition's effect on her experience. It was even ambiguous whether any of the game was real, and the whole thing was just a trauma-induced psychosis-fueled episode triggered by Senua losing Dillion, and the entire game could have just taken place inside her head. Saga definitely concludes that the entire thing was real, but I'm not too disappointed about that. It was just a fun theory. Going to a more tangible setting allows Senua to interact with other characters and build relationships, something sorely missed from the original. From the original game, we got the sense that Senua wasn't well adjusted, but I was curious how she would interact in a social setting. Would she be shy and reclusive because she's been ostracized for hearing voices, or would she be rude and abusive because her voices told her to be? It turns out Senua is surprisingly well adjusted around other people. She's certainly headstrong and confident in her own beliefs, and isn't shy to show her contempt or distrust for others. However, she doesn't act psychotic around them, and she has remarkable control over her condition, considering that the remedies for it wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. Ultimately, it's tough to tell a compelling narrative without other characters. At the same time, some might say the voices in Sacrifice filled the role of different characters, but I'd argue they're part of the background, and the first game is more of a character study than a proper narrative. Meanwhile, Saga is a much more compelling story about dealing with the rage and fury that most people feel within them. It ironically fleshes out Senua more as a character than the game where she was the only character, because the interactions allow us to see multiple sides of her when confronted with different thoughts and ideas. Another improvement that Saga makes is in the combat. Sacrifice's battles were finicky and frustrating, and they were purposely underdesigned because Senua wasn't a warrior and was battling mystical foes much more powerful than her. This created a tenuous balance of attack and defense, where you felt weak but actually weren't. However, when multiple enemies attacked at once, the whole thing quickly fell apart. Saga streamlines the combat by embracing this new, possibly overly cinematic tone, ensuring that only one enemy can engage you at a time. While this often doesn't make sense, as you're usually in a climactic battle where you're the only person a group of enemies is trying to kill, there's no mistaking how much better the combat feels this time around. It has a much better flow, with a far more intense and brutal weight behind each swing, and there are so many different finishes that it almost feels like nearly every enemy has a unique death animation, though that may just be because of the game's short length. The final area in which Saga outclasses Sacrifice is boss battles. The original bosses were serviceable, but with the aforementioned clunky combat, it didn't really hold up against more powerful and gimmicky foes. Saga realizes this, and in line with its new cinematic approach, makes the boss battles an intense run across dangerous terrain. It feels a lot more do or die than any of the previous bosses, and it shows off much more of the game's visual flair that it's trying to sell. However, I'm not a graphics guy, so I don't really care. These bosses are also more emotional than the generic monsters of the last game. With these giants wanting to be forgiven for their sins, their battles have so much weight behind them, allowing Senua to become more empathetic as a character and do more for her likability than anything in the first game. While Hellblade may not be one of Xbox's premier franchises just yet, I do think Saga represents a significant step up in quality from Sacrifice. With more Xbox closures undoubtedly on the way, I hope that Ninja Theory is saved from the culling. I'll be back in 2 days. In the meantime, here's a video about Hellblade 2 is one of the angriest video games I've ever played.